Morning. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I think opening remarks have been really made by our two colleagues who just spoke, Stigmata and Evans have spoken on behalf of all the partners. I think that's very good. And thanks to Professor Adebe for the excellent introduction to this conference. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to welcome our keynote speaker, the keynote speaker of the first theme of this conference. This is the third in the series, as you know, and it's becoming a major event. And our mission is to make it the event of African philanthropy on this continent, the must go-to event every year. Masego Madzwamuse is our keynote speaker to introduce the first theme of this conference. She's a dear sister to many of us here. I have known her for many years, way back to the days when I was with Codesria and she was with the Open Society initiative here in South Africa, OSISA, when she reached out to us and invited us to work together to start what was then called an Economic Justice Institute. So she's been engaged in this institute for a long time. And it was, the institute was the first one we had here in South Africa, in Durban, in 2015. And that was this year when I think the preparations have been made for the Paris Climate Conference, which was one of the landmark conferences of this series. We are now heading towards the 27th, which will be held in Cairo at the end of this year. And then Masego, all along we've been working together. The Economic Justice Institute, by the way, was done differently from all the other institutes that Codesria was organizing. It brought together young activists, young academics in a series of conversations. And Masego has been, she's currently with the Oak Foundation as Environment Program Director. She's on the board of the African Philanthropy Network. She has a track record as a grant maker and a policy analyst specializing in climate justice, natural resource management, and social development, with more than 20 years experience. She's worked on the rights of communities in conservation and supported social movements and civil society organizations advocating for social and economic justice. This has involved many things, including leading research and advocacy, working with the economic justice networks, trade, debt, the aid advocacy groups, parliamentary portfolio committees, conservation and environmental organizations working on natural resource governance and socio-economic and cultural rights. She was, of course, as I said, the executive director of the Southern Africa Trust, and she's been with the Open Society Initiative of Southern Africa. And before all that, was with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, in Botswana. So I'd like to invite our keynote speaker, Masego Madzwamuse, to speak to us, and then we'll have time for an exchange with the audience before she leaves us. Masego, you have the floor.
Thank you, Brima. Habari, Dumelang, Salubonani. I wish I was there in person the energy in that space as old friends get together over the next couple of days. As Maurice said, the pandemic is still with us, and I am a recent victim of COVID. And it has really messed up with my head. So I'm going to spare us a bit in the sense that in my conversations with you today, I will have to rely very heavily on my notes, so I don't forget anything that is important. Ibrima has already painted the picture for us. Every day, climate emergencies are present somewhere for someone, wherever they are in the world. Extreme weather events, famine, sea level rise, forced migration, and poverty mean that for many hundreds millions of people, climate change is a reality. Recently, the International Panel on Climate Change, together with the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, explained to us, released a report, their first joint report, which explains the interconnectedness between biodiversity loss and climate change that we're facing at the moment. It shows that environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change are both driven by human economic activities, and they both reinforce each other. Not only that, there's a direct impact on human well-being. For us in the African continent, this is a reality that we're very familiar with. As we have seen with the COVID pandemic, where the structural driver of the pandemics that we see all over the world has to do with the total collapse of our ecological systems that are driven by unsustainable economic models. And as such, the problems, the multiple crises that we're going through at the moment calls upon us to shift away from siloed responses. And it is for this reason that I am really encouraged to see that at the center of the dialogue over the next couple of days, you are looking at systems change and what this means in terms of the responses from the philanthropy community. From a climate perspective, what are we dealing with? Many have said that we are facing a decisive decade for us to take transformative action. The reason being, global emissions need to be halved relative to where they were in 2019, and we need to halve our global emissions by 2030 so that we can reach net zero by mid-century. We must limit temperature rise to less than 2 degrees and make an effort to make sure that we stay below 1.5 degrees. This has been the challenge for the last 2 decades. And despite over 30 years of efforts, we have failed to address the problem. Now, what do we do to attend and respond to the challenges that we are facing? We have to stop runaway climate change and to build resilience into our life-giving systems so that we can adapt and mitigate the impacts. And across the African continent, the dual and multi-sectional challenges that we face intersect. And we therefore need to define a clear pathway to prosperous development that is rooted in equity and justice. A few points are fundamental and worth mentioning. The 2 previous speakers have made reference to poverty. They've made reference to the hurricanes, the droughts, the floods, and to the reality that those who are most hit by climate change are those that are least responsible. And we see this through record-breaking droughts that we are experiencing in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, as well as increasing deadly tropical cyclones that we're seeing in Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, and many other places around us. Historically, Africa is not a major greenhouse gas emitter at a global level. We have produced only 2% cumulative global emissions. However, our total emissions are estimated to double by 2050. And this is not a scenario that we can afford. We have reached planetary boundaries. Every part of our planetary Earth is hurting. And in turn, that hurt is in turn hurting human well-being. There's also nuance. Nuance in the sense that while we talk about Africa cumulatively contributing very little to greenhouse gas emissions, there's nuance in the sense that some countries within our continent are part of the global major emitters of greenhouse gases, Nigeria and South Africa being amongst them. Let me just pick up here and say that the fact that we contribute least to climate change and that we are vulnerable, the most vulnerable as a continent, is not a new conversation, but it has been a point of dialogue for the past 20 years. And in fact, an argument that is as old as the Paris Declaration itself and even predates it. That cannot be the beginning and the end of our story. It is not the beginning and the end of the African story. What ought to be part of our story is what action looks like and what we envision the solutions to look like from an African perspective. And when I say this, it is not to absolve the Western world and the developed countries that have amassed their wealth and development on the backdrop of colonial extractive systems that have fueled the climate crisis that we face at the moment. It is one that calls upon and calls on the recognition of differentiated responsibilities, while at the same time, the solidarity to act as a collective in addressing one of the biggest global challenges that we face. So far, philanthropy funding at a global level has largely focused on bringing down emissions. And by so doing, focusing solely on the mitigation agenda, we have overlooked the needs to address the immediate vulnerability that communities on the front lines deal with on a daily basis. Climate finance, in its current structure, does not take into account historical redress. There is a fundamental step in systems change and funding for us to build resilience that we need to look into. Africa has repeatedly stated the need to raise $100 billion on an annual basis. Initially, the target was by 2020 to meet the adaptation challenge. However, we have failed to meet this target, and the target has been pushed back by another 5 years. Recently, ClimateWorks released a report in 2020 that noted that out of 1.1 billion that foundations have given to climate mitigation, only 40 million has gone to Africa compared to 150 million that has gone to Europe and 360 million that has gone to the US. Africa gets only 4% of climate mitigation funding. There might be a solid rationale behind this, considering the mitigation burden that is required in Western geographies and other parts of the world. But the skew in resources is unjust. And when we consider the inverse relationship between climate, carbon emissions, and vulnerability that I spoke about earlier, this is where the heart of injustice sits. Africa is being left behind, despite the talk about us needing to leapfrog towards a low carbon development path. I'd like to turn to what is happening in the energy sector. Maurice spoke so passionately about his love for all things energy. The continent's geographic diversity holds an immense potential for solar, wind power, and within its diverse natural resource base, minerals that are needed to fuel and support the clean energy transition and technologies that are required for the future. There is demand, an increase in demand for cobalt, copper, nickel, lithium, and rare earth minerals that is skyrocketing. And the result is a dash for African resources from China, from Europe, from the US, from all over the world. And the question is, will the continent benefit from a future low carbon development path and the energy transition, as well as the dependence on its natural resources to fuel this future? There is an unrecognized and untapped potential in terms of how we position ourselves in the efforts to identify strategic solutions. When we look at the funding that is available for energy transition, Africa attracts only 2% of the investments worldwide. We need up to about 375 billion in investments by 2030 for us to tap into Africa's renewable energy potential by 2030. It far exceeds what we've already been put on the table to fund the adaptation agenda. At the moment, China is the largest financier for renewable energy in Africa and holds 51 market share percent of the investments in renewable energy, with the EU following closely. That said, we have to pay attention to the structure and the manner of funding that is coming through. The EU, the bulk of the funding that comes out of the EU comes in the form of loans, and it is creating or adding on to an already existing debt burden and a problem of debt that is struggling the African continent and hindering our growth. So growing debt in the context of climate finance is an issue that we need to be paying attention to as philanthropy and as the networks and infrastructures that support the philanthropy field. We are, however, noting some positive shifts. And here, African philanthropy must position itself to help the continent take advantage of near-term opportunities as well as future plans. Again, citing the work of ClimateWorks, last month, ClimateWorks recently shared an introductory Africa country profiles for climate philanthropy, focusing on 6 of our major economies in the continent: Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, and South Africa. And from this series, they identify an overview for funders to develop engagement strategies with these countries in consultation with African-led, African-grown, and African-focused organizations and their local partners. I think that the groups that ought to be leading the charge in terms of defining the priorities for investment and providing seed funding ought to be coming from African philanthropy so that we can take control of the future of our continent. A number of other initiatives exist. The African Adaptation Initiative has put together a set of proposals that are drawing on nationally determined commitments in the run-up to COP27 and in preparation of COP27. We as the Oak Foundation are working with other foundations to map the field in the continent and to understand philanthropy, African philanthropy organizations that are funding in climate, African re-granting entities that are supporting climate change work, NGOs, social movements that are focusing on the actions that are required, including some that may not be working on climate change, but have potential to build cross-sectoral and integrated responses to this field. And we would really welcome your partnerships as we look to understand the field and how we may be best placed to support. The philanthropy responses ought to go beyond providing funding. We have to understand where this funding might go and what it might focus on. And at the risk of losing time, I just want to go through a few of the opportunities, the near-term as well as long-term opportunities that I see emerging. We need to have an understanding of tracking the funding flows that are coming to the continent and the sectors that are funded, including understanding where the funding gaps lie. We need to find a way in which we can support regional climate funds that are emerging in the continent. And I'm glad to see in the program that you've got the African Climate Foundation speaking in the next session. We have to look at greening financial systems in the continent and making sure that justice is centered in the design of climate finance, as well as in providing support, institutional support to the robust network of organizations that exist in the continent and are doing important work. Tapping into economic justice movements that Ibrima spoke about earlier, as well as philanthropy playing a really progressive role to meet people where they are at. And to do this, we might want to understand how various organizations are operating and what are the issues that they are organizing around. There is no better place to understand this and to understand sites of struggle and justice concerns than to look at what social movements across the continent are working on. And some of the movements that have been leading the charge for many years include movements that work in the areas of food sovereignty and land rights, because agriculture, being one of the largest contributors of carbon emissions, is going to be yet another frontier of climate action. And also recognizing that agriculture as a sector in our continent is very vulnerable to climate change. We have a suite of organizations that have been doing work for decades that require our support. The Rural Women's Assembly, the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, climate youth movements, and various climate justice movements that we ought to be looking at how to support. The Right Energy Partnership that is spearheaded by indigenous peoples across our continent. But these movements are largely invisible, they're underfunded, and hardly attract stable funding in the long term. The other area that requires attention is one around knowledge and shaping narratives. In a recent report that was done by Carbon Brief, released last year, they picked up a report from the Reuters where they were listing came up with a list of 1,000, what they call the 1,000 Reuters hot list of influential climate scientists. Only 5 came from the African continent. And the list of African authors was dominated by South Africa. And overall, the African authors only make up 1% of authorship for a continent that represents 17% of the world's population. I, for one, know that we don't have a shortage of research capacities and a shortage of thought leadership in the continent to drive the narrative and the discourse on climate change. I've worked with several organizations, and perhaps what we need is to rescue them from the stranglehold of the UN agencies. We have organizations that, like the Climate Research for Development that was established in 2013, the African Academy for Sciences, which is a research network and platform that brings together more than 40 different African institutions and individual researchers. Network of researchers all over the continent that are doing important work and require the funding to be able to do this work. Without doing that, I am going to quote what the continent had to say about that scenario, is that if we don't fund African thought leadership in this work, we are in a situation where, in deciding how the world responds to climate crisis, policymakers and philanthropy rely on research that is generated by white men based in the global south, in the global north. I talk about people based in the global south because I think that that's where the framing ought to be coming from if we're to be looking forward. We have to look at investing in knowledge generation and supporting networks in the global south to do this important work. Lastly is the area of looking at how we support narrative change and strategic communication, and how we support dialogue that is driven by our people. I spoke about the wealth that the continent has and how this wealth is likely to fuel energy transition going into the future. But we cannot do that if we're not shaping the discourse on what this looks like. Let us rally behind some of our very powerful organizations that are doing important work, such as Power Shift Africa, that are shaping the narrative on what we do with the resources and how we might want to take this wealth forward. In conclusion, Chair, I would like to just wrap up by saying that a lasting solution to climate crisis is more than a technical and managerial response. We need to think about climate responses as part of human rights approaches to address social inequality and agency. And at the heart of this, justice and equity are not nice to have. They are essential. It is not the soft work. It is the work of the day. Where we are going is as important as how we get there. And the time for African philanthropy to step up is now. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, I see hand behind there. I see Kera. You have you holding? Okay, Kera, go. Yeah, you have.
Thank you, Masego, for that talk, and it's also lovely to see you on the screen after so long. I just wanted to ask, out of curiosity, because you are mentioning some of the investments that are being made on the African continent, the fact that we're suffering the most from climate change issues and yet we're the least contributor. of greenhouse gases. So I wanted to find out, is there any investments or
Historically,
plans being made on
philanthropy
indigenous
or sharing.
ways of doing things? I mean, you will know that some of our elders, they sort of knew how to read weather patterns, and also ways in which to build infrastructure so that it can be resilient to such impacts. Some of these things are there indigenously. Is there any way that we can tap into that knowledge? Thank you.
Yeah, local knowledge is absolutely important. I saw a hand on this side, but I think he was first, the gentleman behind there. 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Chair, I think you can hear me, and also thank you very much to Madam Masego. First of all, I have to acknowledge that I've learned a lot.
Introduce yourself, 1 minute, who you are, and then...
Yes, my name is Joe. I work with smallholder farmers in Eastern and Southern Africa. My question would, first of all, I appreciate the keynote speech. In fact, we have learned a lot about investments and about investment in Africa. Now, the question that I would like to pose, maybe from your own perspective. You said that Africa is likely to double greenhouse gas emission within 30 years, or maybe by 2030. Now, I just wanted to get your feel in terms of which way now we should take, because some countries, I think the European Union, they're saying by 2030 they would cut, I don't know, by 50% or so, utilization of fuel. So what is the feel and what is the perspective of the African continent? Bearing in the fact that we are very backward in terms of development compared to the other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I'm sorry, I think you have to pass it on. Masego, you want to respond to those 3 questions?
Yes, thank you. I'll take the first question on the knowledge gap. Briggs asks what is leading to that scenario where we are seeing only 1% of African authorship appearing on the list of the most influential climate scientists. I want to go back to what I said about it is not about the lack of research that is being done in the continent. I think it's largely to do, there's a number of things that are happening. Firstly, it has to do with the lack of visibility of African research that is already being done in the continent. As part of UNECA's program of work, UNECA has got an Africa Climate Policy Center that has been funding networks of African-based climate research work for more than 15 years, as far as my memory serves me. But the research, in a way, does not find itself into the public domain, and it does not find itself readily available in outlets that journalists depend on for writing their news articles and so forth. Apart from that, I think there's other areas that require investments in research. Many of our research institutions are underfunded, and they depend on collaborative funding with institutions that are based in the global north. And that funding often comes with, with conditions where the research questions are defined elsewhere, not in our continent. So the research itself is not answering the questions that are topical for the continent and must resolve the pressing questions that we have for supporting our development agenda. The third issue around research is also around the gender blind spots that is available. The climate science field and information that is available in the public domain is dominated by research that is done by male scientists. Recently, Femnet, not Femnet, Akina Mama wa Africa, on Women's Day, and I think it was also, they did the same on Africa Day. They released a directory of African women and African feminists that are leading scientists on climate change in the continent, and encouraging policymakers, encouraging journalists that are based in the continent to quote the work that is being done by the women and give it the visibility that it requires. We need to be making some investments around scaling capacity and research capacity for climate modeling research. We don't have that in the continent, and we tend to depend on external resources for some of this work. So for a lot of the research institutions that are in the room, I think there's an open invitation for you to be part of the networks, work with the social movements, work with our climate negotiators, work with some of the institutions that I spoke with earlier, and look at where the gaps are in research and how you might help to advance that agenda. And we need to find a way of supporting multidisciplinary research in this space. And to wrap that up, Africa No Filter has also started looking at ways in which they can support African climate journalism, and to get us telling our own stories and shaping the narrative in the public domain. Kira asked a question around investments in indigenous knowledge systems. And I think I want to respond this one with telling a little story, and I'll really quickly. When I was still with the Southern Africa Trust, or was it with the Open Society, but it was one in my previous capacities, I recall visiting Malawi and speaking to communities that had been affected by Cyclone Idai. And so when I was asking the community to, we were just really sharing stories about how the crisis happened. And there was one particular community that had managed to make it to higher ground and had minimized the losses from the cyclone. And I asked them, how was this possible? And one of the local communities told me that at a particular time, they noticed that there was an invasion of ants in the village. And because they already live in a flood-prone area, they know that when they see ants at large scale, it is a sign that the floods are coming. And the chief in that village alerted the community and asked people to move all their goods to higher ground, and they managed to escape the floods. The ones that did not escape the floods said to us they had heard news in the radio that the floods were coming. And but on radio, as part of the weather news, they were not told about the extent of the floods. And they thought, if floods are coming, floods come every year. But the information that was delivered to the communities was not precise. And as a result, they stayed in their villages were flooded, and they lost their goods. With that little story, what I'm really trying to say is our indigenous knowledge systems exist. They're very important for supporting adaptation responses. But when we look at the frequency of the natural disasters that we are facing and the extent of them, we find that our indigenous knowledge systems are in some cases not robust enough and don't take us far enough in mitigating the impacts of climate change. So we need to find a way of combining and building on our indigenous knowledge systems with technology, with science, and with making sure that climate science information gets to the communities and is packaged in a way that is relatable, and communities can use it to make decisions about what to do next. But information on itself is not enough if you don't have the capacity, if you don't have the financial muscle if you don't have the resources to make the shifts that you're being asked to make, right? So adaptive capacity tends to be undermined by people's socioeconomic conditions. And that's why at the beginning I was saying we need an intersectoral and a multisectoral response to the climate crisis. So it's not just about the science, it's not just about the technological responses, but it's also about the socioeconomic capacities that enable people to be able to cushion the impacts of climate change. The last question is a very interesting one. How do we avoid, how do we ensure that we avoid Africa doubling its emissions by 2030? I think that is the question of the day. And it is the question of the day in the sense that I think it's a conversation that Africans in Africa must have and have with urgency. What is happening at the moment is that conversation is happening elsewhere, right? In my remarks, I talked about Africa hosting the bulk of the transition minerals that the renewable energy, the future, which is a low carbon development path, depends on. But we are not positioned to benefit from that. But within that energy mix, there is deposits of fossil fuel that are available in our continent: Senegal, Mozambique, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, the DRC. The reality is, for us to stay below the 1.5 degree targets that we're talking about by 2030, we cannot tap into the fossil fuels to fuel our development. Then what do the alternatives look like? The alternatives for renewable energy, and where would the finance come from? And I think this is a point of negotiating with the with the developed world, and a point of negotiating around climate finance, looking at how we can finance Africa's energy transition. And I won't go further into that, except to say that PowerShift is one of the organizations that is actually hosting a series of conversations where they're saying, let's have a discussion about what to do with Africa's gas deposits. We do understand that going forward, gas cannot be part of the energy mix if we are to avoid climate catastrophe. But if we're keeping gas in the ground, what are the alternatives, and how might we finance Africa's development future? That is a conversation that we need to make sure that we are sitting at the center of. The African Climate Foundation, they'll be speaking later, is working with a number of our countries to look at what a sustainable energy mix looks like for a low carbon development path going forward. And I think that is a space that we ought to be looking at engaging with.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. And you've touched on so many issues. Very quick, a few points I want to come back to very quickly before giving the floor back to the moderator. I think that point you are raising it's also the whole issue of the necessity of a transition period, I suppose, right? That's the subject of the negotiation, I guess. What do we do? We have this. I mean, the hopes have gone so high. I see this in Senegal, I see it in Mozambique. People have been in poverty for many years, and then you got these discoveries of oil and gas, and then you're told, no, you can't touch them. So what do you do? How long will the transition take, or is there a transition period anyway? So I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. So that was an excellent question. The point about the research, the narratives, knowledge production to inform the narratives, and so on. It's a real issue. It's a big issue that African research has been confronted with for many years. There is obviously the undercounting. I mean, not all that has been produced has been taken care of. There is the problem of the visibility, but there is also the problem of the instruments of measurement. What do you use to measure production? Where do you look? What research is being taken into account, and what research doesn't even fit into the frameworks? When the counting is being done, and in some instances, there have been attempts actually to invent new ways of looking at what the production has been and measuring the production and the quality of the production. So I guess that's a very important point. But you're also right about the need to scale up the levels of production, the capacity to produce knowledge on the continent, because that is, at the end of the day, very important for the shaping of the narratives. And you've highlighted not only the magnitude of the problem, but also the magnitude of the potential, for making a difference, or for producing clean energy on the continent, and for contributing immensely to shaping things differently. I think this has been very, very important. You've highlighted the risks associated with that, the necessity, at the end of the day, for Africa to take control of our future, right? To not only decolonize the future, but to shape the future as we want it to be for us. I think, we just have to thank you for these excellent contributions. And it's not all about the technicalities, right? It's a justice issue. It's about equity. It's more on the technical aspects, as you've rightly pointed out. The final point is, you've not touched upon it explicitly, but I think it was implicit in your presentation. You've got the big conference just around the corner. How do we go there? What is the conversation going on the continent? How do we prepare that? How do we make it an important milestone in the process towards this transformation that we are aspiring for, towards the taking over of the control of the processes, but also of the narratives related to climate change and Africa. So thank you really, really, really so much. I think you deserve a round of applause and for the excellent presentation. And thanks to CAPSI and the team for facilitating this participation from a distance. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brimak. Let's give him a hand also. Thank you. Much appreciated. And our keynote, Masego